like, I was reading all these different things for, rating what's the hardest creek crossing, what's the worst one, and Sandy and White River were always close to the top, and I would say, based on the way we did it, those were so close to the bottom for me.
Yeah.
And their absolute last creek crossing, that was, like, the one that was the easiest for them, is the one that I would put at the very top. And it was just fascinating to me because it's like you can read all these different resources and hear what people say is the easiest or the hardest, but you can't necessarily go exclusively based on that or trust that because A, you never know someone's level of experience or what kind of scenarios they've been in before, but B, you also don't know, like, their July might be a totally different July. They might have had more snow, they might have had less snow, they might have gotten there earlier in the day, it might have been a really hot day. Hi, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Molly.
And you're listening to the Two Sisters on Adventures podcast, Timberline Trail edition. So Molly and I have had this trail on our adventures list for quite a while, but I feel like we never really made it a priority to get out and do it. And I honestly don't know if it was because it was too close to where we were living.
Maybe.
Or if we just kept finding more options that were a little longer and we wanted to spend more days out in the wilderness when we had more limited time off. But we finally put it into our calendars as a definite due in 2022. And then we didn't do it. Do you remember why?
Yeah, I do. Okay. And I'll even mention, I think it was because when we lived in Oregon, we lived in Salem. And so if we were trying to do something fairly close proximity to us, it was in the Mount Jefferson Wilderness.
Or the Three Sisters.
Wilderness. So I think we always prioritized hiking in those areas. And really, as far as hiking in the Mount Hood National Forest, I think we had maybe done two or three hikes on Mount Hood itself, and then just a couple more in that similar vicinity. So
plus I think that Mount Hood just has this reputation for being really crowded, and we were always just interested in spending time with less people. So I think that also just kind of was a piece of it. A lot of
the trailheads you'd show up in the Mount Jefferson Wilderness, even on a weekend, there's just a couple cars in the parking lot versus I know it was always a constant struggle if we wanted to go, Mirror Lake or something, or Tom, Dick, and Harry. You get there, if you're going on a weekend, you have to get there early because of the proximity to Portland, I think. So I think that was maybe why we knew about the trail, but it wasn't really high on our list. And after doing the trail, I'm like, wow, it could have been way higher in our priority list. And so we're excited to talk about it. But Carrie mentioned in 2022, we said this is definitely a trail we want to do. And we were training for the John Muir Trail at that point, and we kind of were ramping up mileage. And so we figured that maybe 2 days on the Timberline Trail or up to 3 would be what we'd try to do.
Yeah, well, actually, I'm going to butt in. We're going to do a totally different trail that was 7 days, remember? But there was a fire. So then we cobbled together a plan where we were going to do a one night, and then 1 night on the Timberline Trail, which would have been 2 days.
To try to get, because we were wanting to do something in the realm of, I think it was 80 to 100 miles, because we were trying to ramp up mileage so that then we would be at least, exactly, half of what we needed to do for the John Muir Trail. So, like Carrie mentioned, our trail that we were planning to do that was going to be in that 100-ish mile range, there was a fire, so we had to pivot, and we ended up doing something really fun. We went to the Olympic Peninsula, the Alpine Lakes Wilderness, and then we were going to do the Timberline Trail in 2 days, 1 night. And we were driving towards the Timberline Trail to tag on that last 40 or so miles for our big week of training. And Carrie got email or message on her phone?
No, I think it was just on Facebook, actually. I saw that they were going to reopen the Mount Jefferson Wilderness in certain areas and trailheads because it had been really devastated by a fire in 2020. And I was just so excited. I was looking at it, and it was funny because it was still going to be a 40-mile trip. That was one where the only trailhead that was opening where we could get a permit to get to the spot we wanted to get to was going to be still 20 miles each way, or 19 miles or something like that. And so I said, Molly, I think if we go home instead, as we're driving to the trailhead, let's go home and then wait 3 days till they open this trail. And then let's go there and try to experience that spot, kind of as some of the first people back after the fires and when not a lot of people know. So it was funny because it just got scratched right off our list for 2022.
And it all worked out really good. Yeah. And leave it to us to, do the intro for the Timberline Trail, talking about everything but the Timberline Trail. But anyways, it worked out good that we redid our plans in 2022 because then we got to prioritize the Timberline Trail for 2023. Yeah. We actually used it as part of like a ramp up of backpacking trips to kind of sequentially increase mileages. And so the Timberline Trail, we like it because it's kind of that moderate distance where it's, if you want to do more than one night, you totally can.
But probably it'll be better too.
Yeah.
The one night thing was just for the sake of time. It really wasn't because we thought it was the best option.
And what were we the most nervous about doing it in one night?
River crossings. Yeah. Just because there was no good way to time your river crossings. It was just like they're all so spread out that there was no way to say like, well, I'll just hit up all of these in the morning versus in the evening. But I thought you were going to say the reason we did it in 2023, yes, it was part of our building up, but we got a text from one of our really good friends in Oregon in like around Christmas, I'd say in 2022, saying that she and her brother wanted to go backpacking for their first time, I think, right?
Yeah.
And he really wanted to do the Timberline Trail. And I was like mildly jealous, but also so excited for them.
Yeah.
And I feel like I was texting them a lot of information because the one thing that is kind of a bigger concern on this trail is there are some somewhat difficult river crossings depending on when you do them. They can be dangerous. And so I kind of was like, I don't want to just throw them to the wolves and be like, just do it. So I was trying to send them information from the PCT website about how to do creek crossings and all that kind of stuff. And I can't remember if she said it or if we were like, oh, we wish we could just go with you.
Yeah.
And then I don't know if we ever were actually invited, but somehow
we just ended up
we certainly
as part of the
did
group.
Tag right along.
And it was really fun. Yeah. So yeah, that was something that then we were thinking about and planning for several months. But yeah, we figured today that we would spend some time just chatting about different considerations and planning that went into our hike of the Timberline Trail this last summer.
So when you're planning a trip on the Timberline Trail, the good news is there's a ton of resources. Mm-hmm. Like you can just plug in, 2-night, 3-day itinerary, one night, 2-day. I feel like there was even 5-day itineraries and stuff like that. But it's still really tricky because everyone's so unique in how they want to go about the trail. And we had 3 days and 2 nights. That was the time that we were able to have allotted for our time on the trail. So it was pretty set that was going to be the amount of time. And I feel like I would Google and I didn't find any itineraries I really loved because there are 6, I believe, major creek crossings on this trail. So it would be, and this would be going clockwise from Timberline Lodge. The order would be Sandy River, Ladd Creek, I believe, Coe Creek, Elliott Creek, Newton Creek, and White River. Those are the more major creek or river crossings that you have to do on this trail. And it just seemed like I didn't want to set us up to where we were going to get to any of these creek crossings late in the day, because when you're going to cross a river, I feel like we've talked about this before, but I can't remember, or creek crossing, it's always good to get there earlier in the day, because when they're this close to the mountain, as the glaciers heat up, they release more and more water throughout the day. So you have a better chance of having an easier creek crossing if you go in the morning. And it is kind of amazing sometimes to actually see a creek in the morning versus in the late afternoon. Yeah. It's crazy how different it can be. If you go in the morning, you might honestly just feel like that was nothing. Maybe it was a rock hop. Maybe you just got in and walked across. You might not have even spent any time looking for another crossing point, because when you go there, you're just like, what was the problem with this one?
Just hop across a couple rocks.
Yeah. And so...
And Carrie and I had the ability to even witness that on a hike into Jeff Park from the Pamelia Creek Trailhead. I'm blanking on the name of it. I don't know if you remember.
It's not Kennedy. That's what I always want to call it.
But so we crossed it one time, like the way in, I think we crossed it at 3 p.m.
Yeah.
And then the way out, we crossed it at maybe 9 a.m. Yeah. And it was pretty remarkable how, we had to get wet, almost to the knee, crossing at 3 p.m. And going across in the morning, it was a rock hop. We didn't get wet at all. And that's the thing about glacially fed creeks or streams, they're going to fluctuate like that. I don't know if that would apply so much if you're not in an area where it's glaciated.
No, probably not.
But, I mean, this is the Pacific Northwest,
yeah,
right?
So, and if you're recreating on a volcano, there's probably going to be glaciers, and they're probably going to be feeding water,
Definitely.
etc. And I think the other thing that was interesting that time was we noticed how loud it was at night in the park, but when we got up in the morning, you couldn't hear. Do you remember? We could hear the rivers just like running because it was so hot.
And it's pretty common that the volume of water is high as the day goes on, and then it stays high for a while at night as well, which you think, well, it's not actively melting, but that water is all coming down from what it had done.
It takes a certain amount of time to cover a distance, you know, right? Because sometimes they say it's better to cross it like later in the day if it's a certain distance downstream from the glacier, because you know, like all the water that's coming overnight is hitting it in the early morning, and I don't know the exact mileage and all that kind of stuff, so you'd have to do your own research on that because we've not ever been that far away from a glacier. But it's just interesting because so anyway, my whole point in this whole planning process was I didn't want to bring people who are on their first backpacking trip and just say like, let's go at the worst time of day and a bunch of like kind of scary river crossings.
And a unique thing about the Timberline Trail, and how you mentioned this before, is if you're doing it in, say, the like 2 days or 3 days, inevitably you're gonna have to cross one of the more major crossings later in the day. So you just have to kind of prioritize which one you actually want to cross later in the day. And maybe if you were doing a 4-day itinerary, you'd be able to get everyone in the morning.
Probably.
And that's a cool way to do an itinerary too, because there are people who stayed, I think, in Elk Cove that said it was a beautiful spot to camp. But that wouldn't really work into an itinerary for us based on where we were starting and doing it in 3 days. So there's lots of flexibility that you do have.
And I mean, you do have flexibility too on where you start. I looked at it, there's so many different entry points and exit points. There's the what is it, Cooper's Spur campground, I want to say. Or is that the Tilly Jane Trailhead, actually? Is that what that's called? I don't know.
Are we talking about Clouds Rest?
Clouds Rest, thank you. But there's so many different spots. Like there's the Clouds Rest one where you can start. There's
the Ramona Falls
access points.
Obviously,
Umbrella Falls actually is also an access point for some people. The Timberline Lodge. There's so many different access points, and I'm missing some for sure.
Are some as well.
Yeah, McNeil Point. I feel like people probably don't really prefer to start at that trailhead, but you could. So anyway, there's a ton of different ones, but I wanted to start at the Timberline Lodge just because it's kind of iconic. And then you have a bathroom where you start and finish with running water. And there's also a nice parking lot. It's not like your car's really getting left overnight in a weird location. Just because there's always people around, you know, so it just seemed like a better starting point. It was closer to where we were staying anyways. You don't have to take unpaved roads. So from where we were starting, I just wanted to set us up for a fun trip, for success in terms of where the river crossings were. And so I debated for a long time going clockwise versus going counterclockwise, because one of the last crossings that you'll do if you're going clockwise right before you get to Timberline Lodge is the Sandy River. And that can be, it's interesting because, go ahead.
Clockwise before you get to the Timberline Lodge would be the White River, correct?
Sorry. Oh, it would be White River. Yeah, you're right. Sorry. It would be White River. Rewind. And it would be called the White River.
Yes.
Anyway, so that one is one that a lot of people put at the top of their list for the scariest creek crossing. And ironically, I think, like, I was reading all these different things for, you know, rating what's the hardest creek crossing, what's the worst one, and Sandy and White River were always close to the top, and I would say, based on the way we did it, those were so close to the bottom for me. And their absolute last creek crossing, that was, like, the one that was the easiest for them, is the one that I would put at the very top. And it was just fascinating to me because it's like you can read all these different resources and hear what people say is the easiest or the hardest, but you can't necessarily go exclusively based on that or trust that, because A, you never know someone's level of experience or what kind of scenarios they've been in before, but B, you also don't know, like, their July might be a totally different July. They might have had more snow. They might have had less snow. They might have gotten there earlier in the day. It might have been a really hot day. Like, it might have, you know, been one of those 100-degree days. It might have been a 65-degree day, you know? And so there's so much variation that you can just kind of take what information is out there and try to do with it what you can.
And even when you mentioned the time of year, that reminded me when we were planning to do the Timberline Trail in 2022, before we were going to loop it into our August trip, we actually were going to try it in July. We had it on our list for something earlier in July, and then we started looking at trip reports, and maybe 1 or 2 groups had been able to write a trip report about completing the trail, and they talked about multiple like high angled snow sections. And so we had decided like, okay, well, we're not interested in doing it in those conditions. So also paying attention to, as I'm sure you are aware, the snow levels for the season, and looking at, you know, where the snow is located, because the Timberline Trail is pretty fun where you spend a decent amount of time at a little bit of a higher elevation, which the highest elevation being, you know, just above 7,000 feet, but you get to bump up above 5,000 feet for a decent percentage of the trail.
Yeah. So another thing that I didn't really talk about was most people go clockwise on this trail.
Yeah.
That is, I would say, I mean, the greatest percentage of people who go on this trail choose to go clockwise. I kind of wanted to go counterclockwise, both because I was trying to set us up differently for the river crossings, and it seemed for our itinerary that would work best, but also because I feel like, I guess when people are doing one thing, I kind of want to do it the other way. And I couldn't find any research saying that it specifically was a terrible way to go.
Yeah.
You know, sometimes it might be very clear, like you're going to have this horrible slog. And I think the biggest complaint for people going counterclockwise is that when you hit Ramona Falls, everything's uphill from there.
Yeah.
But the thing about Ramona Falls is it's the low point. So you're gonna go uphill either way from Ramona Falls. It might be a slightly shorter distance, but at least for us, when we were going up from Ramona Falls, the place that we were going to go to was the Timberline Lodge and be done, you know?
Yeah, honestly.
So to me, it was kind of like, does it really matter? You know, you're going to go uphill either way. That you're on a trail, you know? What, you don't want to go uphill?
Then I guess you shouldn't be hiking around a volcano.
Exactly.
That's another thing, being, you know, having gone around or partial circumnavigations of other volcanoes in the PNW, it's pretty much inevitable that you're going to be either going up or down the majority of the time, because once again, you have glaciers along the volcano, and then the creeks or rivers that flow from those glaciers are going to cause valleys. And so basically your adventure is going to be going down to one creek crossing it, and then going up from there. So it's a journey of up and down, and sometimes you can loop together bigger uphill or downhill days depending on your length of the day, like how many miles you're traveling or which direction you're going. But it is true, in the end you're going to be doing the same distance and elevation no matter how you slice it.
So it just, to me, I thought, well, we may as well try that. Also, I wanted us to have a better shot at getting to campsites and not having a ton of people staying around them. And the way that we were going, some of the campsites we were going to stay at were going to be less popular or less common than what I'd seen other people talking about. So those were just some of the big considerations that we had in mind when we planned our itinerary. One thing that did throw a loop in it was that there was a section of the trail that ended up being closed exclusively for one of the days that we were on it. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
Yeah.
I don't know if we've mentioned this yet, but the Timberline Trail is about 42 miles in length.
It depends on
GPS is always different.
Depends on what resources. Like if you're using All Trails, I think it says 39.8. We saw in a couple websites we looked into 42 miles. For us, like Kiri mentioned, we ended up taking a reroute for a part of the trail because of a closure. So we were, I think, up to 46 miles at the end. And if I pull it up real quick here, 46 miles and about 11,398 feet of elevation. But it's something in that range.
Other resources say about 10,800 feet of ascent. But again, GPS is like great and reliable, but it's also always going to have those little variations. So once again, like a nice range trail for, you know, something in the range of 2 to 4 or 5 day trip. And then a good amount of elevation actually for the amount of miles that you're doing. So you will have a challenge in front of you, and that's a fun thing. I like it. And another thing that's super fun about circumnavigating a volcano is you get to see all these different ecosystems. So it'll be fun for us to be able to talk about that. But you know, there's always the dry side of a mountain, the wetter side of a mountain. There's high alpine areas that you get to go through, and there's spots that are going to have maybe some, you know, wildflowers and things like that. So it is something where even though you're in the same geographical area really the whole time, you get to kind of have a lot of different experiences. So that's one thing that really is fun about it.
And I also just enjoy the different facets of the mountain, the different views. Like, I think in your, I don't know, like in a very simplistic mindset, you think of a mountain looking one way, but that's just from one angle. And as you continue to journey around it, you get to see all the different angles unlocked. So it was fun to view Mount Hood from all those different angles. And then it was even interesting when you would be walking along one side, like the views that you get of, say, like Mount Jefferson or Mount Adams, and then at one point you'd finally kind of turn the corner and then your view would change. But it's just interesting to cover that ground and be able to kind of track your progress as you move around the peak. So another reason we really like it. And I mentioned this on our last episode, but once again, Carrie and I, having lived in Oregon for 4 years, we did a lot of different hiking and backpacking in a lot of the different kind of terrain in Oregon. And so going around Mount Hood on the Timberline Trail, we had chances to just see like so much scenery that reminded us of many different areas in Oregon. Like, I feel like there were sections that reminded me of like the Mount Hood, or sorry, of the Mount Jefferson area. There were sections that reminded me of some of the kind of coastal forests, like over by Tillamook. And there were areas that even reminded me of like the Sisters, and areas that were unique to Mount Hood. So it was a really cool way to almost get like a quick appetizer for everything that you could do in Oregon in one trip, which was really, really fun. And we did end up choosing the end of July to complete our trip, and we timed it perfectly unknowingly for a lot of beautiful wildflowers. So that was a treat for sure.
Yeah. And one thing I will say is I never felt like it was extremely overcrowded. There were definitely, you could expect to see people, but it wasn't one of those things where we've been hiking in Washington on a weekend. That can be a true zoo if you're going to a place that's very popular. And especially with a day hike. Backpacking, you know, sometimes even if you're backpacking in popular places, it can just be like, it's continuous people, you know, you're like single file in a line of 20. But I never felt that way on the Timberline Trail.
And we did start it on a Sunday, so we did our trail Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. So that gave us a little less crowds because we weren't doing it on a full weekend, or even like the Friday, Saturday, Sunday that many people would fit into their work schedule. But yeah, I would say that there was plenty of time to appreciate just natural spaces without rubbing shoulders with too many hikers, which it was a nice balance.
But we got to meet a fun number of hikers, I'd say, and visit with some hikers. So yeah, everything was good. So I put up a little question box on our Instagram and Facebook this past week to see if anybody had any specific questions about the Timberline Trail. And we basically have answered all the questions just through what we were talking about already. But we did have one where someone was asking about the amount of physical preparation that you have to do for this trail. And this was kind of an interesting year for us because typically we train for hiking by hiking. But we were living in the Midwest. We were working full-time jobs, which we had worked full-time when we were living in Oregon as well. But it's just a little bit different, I'd say, here. It's not like you can kind of just bop out to a 10-mile, 15-mile hike as easily with the same amount of elevation gain. So one of the things that we did was whenever we would have days off where we were in the same geographical location, we would just put on our packs, put some weight in them, and we would just go for a walk. Sometimes it was only 4 miles, but our packs were pretty heavy. I feel like they were probably like 30 pounds. And
I think we would range. I mean, we do some, like the lower end was like 4 miles. The upper end was probably, with the weighted walks, like 8 or 9. And then we also looped in a couple of hikes where we'd get a decent amount of elevation gain.
And we also did, there's this location close to us where you can go up a bunch of stairs to see a viewpoint. So we put our packs on one day and we did those stairs. So we did 1,000 feet of gain. Which was just funny because it's also like a tourist area. So people would be like, what are you training for? Be like, just a lot of stuff.
Yeah, including the Timberline Trail.
So that was one thing we did. And
our friend, her brother, he was kind of wondering what he could do because he was in a similar kind of region where there are parks, but it's not like you're living somewhere where, you could run up an area that's, 2,000 feet of elevation really easily to get that training. So we kind of recommended the same thing that we were doing, just like including weighted walking. And I think I read somewhere talking about getting ready for longer distance backpacking trips, even just the ability to walk with a weighted pack for like 3 hours at a time without, needing a rest break. That being a good metric to say like, okay, I could start to take on something. And I still wouldn't, do something like that and then go straight into a trail that's like 500 miles long if you weren't planning to ramp up over time. But it seemed to work well for a trail of the distance of the Timberline Trail. And I would say as we were going around, definitely we had a couple longer days. And I did feel tired, but I felt like it was all very doable for how I had trained.
Yeah, I would agree. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Two Sisters on Adventures podcast. Please feel free to follow us on Facebook or Instagram if you want to either send us questions about this trail that we can answer during the podcast, or if you want to just see pictures and videos of the things we talked about today. We also have a video podcast available on YouTube. We can also be found at Two Sisters on Adventures there. And if you want to follow, subscribe, like, comment on our podcast, that's always appreciated. And we're always glad for anyone who chooses to listen. So, yeah, thanks so much and have a good one.
Yeah.
Bye.
Next week, we'll have our first episode for our first day of the Timberline Trail.
Bye.
Bye.